Welcome to Two Beans in a Pod. Today, we're diving into the history of one of the calendar's most, universally recognized days, Halloween. We all know the modern version, right? Costumes, trick-or-treating, tons of candy. But when you actually look back, the historical origins are really complex. They span millennia, different cultures. It's quite a journey.
It really is. And, when we talk about these big foundational holidays, the question isn't just what happened historically, but maybe more like which influence really provided the essential structure, the spirit that allowed the modern holiday to survive and, become what it is today.
Exactly. So the central question we're focusing on is pretty substantive. What is the primary foundational influence of modern Halloween? Is the holiday, at its core, fundamentally Christian, deriving its structure, its very name, from the Allhallowtide observances of the medieval church? Or is its core identity actually rooted much deeper in the ancient Gallic festival of Samhain, which the church, perhaps merely attempted to replace or absorb?
My position is that the enduring foundational spirit of the celebration, that focus on the dead, possibly returning, the idea of a thin veil between worlds, even the necessary mischief involved, I think that's rooted firmly in Samhain. The church, they certainly co-opted the date, maybe Christianized some elements, but they didn't invent the deep-seated reason for the celebration itself.
And I'm going to argue that the structure, and frankly, the sheer survival of the holiday into the modern era, are fundamentally Christian. The name itself, right? Halloween. It's a contraction of All Hallows Eve, the vigil observed right before the Feast of All Saints. So my position really rests on what I see as firm evidence from the liturgical calendar and traceable Christian folk practices. So let's start with that essential structure you mentioned. Allhallowtide is, it's a 3-day observance in the Christian calendar. All Hallows Eve on October 31st, then All Hallows Day or All Saints Day on November 1st, and finally All Souls Day on November 2nd. Now, the standardization of All Saints' Day on November 1st, that was established universally by Pope Gregory IV back in the 9th century. And it seems like a pretty strategic move, placing this major Christian celebration precisely where the Celtic Samhain festival traditionally concluded, marking the end of the harvest. To me, this suggested was less about simple coexistence and maybe more about establishing a pious institutional replacement for existing, possibly unruly folk rites.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that detailed historical tracing of the calendar dates, I really do. But isn't that arguably just the packaging? You've shown us the calendar date, the name, but you haven't quite accounted for let's call it the engine driving the customs themselves. Samhain, which was celebrated across the Celtic British Isles, wasn't just an end-of-harvest marker. It was actually the sacred Celtic New Year. It marked the beginning of the darker half of the year. And critically, it was understood as this uniquely liminal time, a period when the veil between this world and, the other world grew thin.
Okay, but why does that liminality matter so fundamentally for Halloween today?
Well, because this belief, this idea of the thin veil, it's the essential foundation, I'd argue, for the entire holiday's supernatural association. This is why people historically feared the night, why they felt the need to take precautions. Think about practices like lighting these massive community bonfires. Partly practical, sure, but also believed to guide friendly souls and maybe repel darker energies. And then there's guising, dressing in disguise, often using animal hides or rough costumes. We have records of this in Celtic areas starting from, at least the 16th century. And the purpose seems to have been explicitly to either appease or perhaps hide from those wandering spirits, the AOC, and other powerful beings during this highly sensitive transitional time. That necessary act of disguise or appeasement, that links directly back to a deep-seated Gaelic folk impulse, long before the church's influence was fully established in those areas.
Okay, that brings us very neatly to the custom we all recognize today, trick-or-treating. Now, I would argue that the documented practice of souling provides a much more robust, much more traceable lineage for this element than perhaps vaguer notions of appeasing fairies or spirits. Souling, which dates back reliably to the 15th century, was pretty clearly framed as a devotional act. It was an act of Christian charity, where the poor, often children, would go door to door collecting soul cakes. Sometimes these were even marked with a cross. And in exchange, they offered prayers for the souls of the household's dead, specifically hoping to help them out of purgatory. That's a distinctly Christian concern.
That's a compelling point for maybe the structure of house-to-house visits. I grant you that. But doesn't it potentially miss the historical reality of the pressure behind the practice in some regions? While souling certainly provided a veneer of Christian charity, and yes, institutionalized the act to some extent, the impulse to offer food or gifts to beings abroad that night, that might be much older than the formal doctrine of purgatory. You can kind of see this tension reflected in how guising customs persisted, particularly in Scotland and Ireland, alongside or perhaps evolving from souling.
But weren't those guising traditions often documented as separate from souling? And they certainly didn't immediately morph into the modern custom, which is, let's be honest, much more focused on generalized solicitation, give me candy, than specific pious prayer for souls.
I disagree slightly there. In those specific Gaelic areas, reports describe youths, sometimes with blackened faces or wearing these makeshift costumes, explicitly threatening mischief, the trick part, if they weren't welcomed or rewarded with food or coins. That element of threat, or maybe playful menace, connects much more closely, I think, to the older, more unruly, almost demanding Gaelic folk customs than it does to purely pious almsgiving. It suggests a person at the door wasn't just seen as a poor supplicant needing charity, but perhaps as someone representing or acting on behalf of the powerful, maybe even dangerous forces that were thought to be abroad on that specific night. So yes, it's likely a synthesis over time, but the founding idea offering appeasement to avoid harm or mischief, that seems deeply rooted in the Samhain worldview and its associated anxieties. And, moving beyond just the door-to-door customs, we really have to examine the enduring role of divination games. These were absolutely central to Halloween festivities, well into the 19th century, especially in Celtic regions like Ireland and Scotland. The prevalence of games like apple bobbing or roasting nuts by the fire to predict who your true love would be, looking into scrying mirrors, or that saucer game, the Puccini, which supposedly predicted death, marriage, or even emigration. All of this really highlights Samhain's original function. As a Celtic New Year, Samhain was considered the most potent time to try and foretell events for the coming cycle. Apples and nuts, incidentally, had strong associations with the otherworld and divine wisdom in Celtic mythology.
I'm not entirely convinced that this focus on fate prediction is exclusively Celtic, or that it necessitates a primary Samhain origin for those specific practices. That line of reasoning, I think, risks ignoring other significant converging influences that were also at play. For instance, the widespread use of apples in those fortune-telling games. You mentioned apple bobbing, which is iconic. Well, that was also likely heavily influenced by Roman traditions. As the Roman Empire expanded into Britain, their festival of Pomona, the goddess of fruit trees and orchards, seems to have blended pretty seamlessly with local autumnal customs, including whatever was happening around Samhain time. So you can't really claim the fruit symbolism exclusively for Samhain when Roman influence was so powerful and pervasive for centuries. Furthermore, the general interest in predicting death and contemplating the future wasn't exclusive to Celtic paganism either. Medieval Christian Europe had a profound cultural tradition centered on memento mori, the constant reminder to remember death, and also the danse macabre, the dance of death imagery.
Could you maybe clarify that link to the medieval traditions for us a bit more? How does that connect directly?
Certainly. The dance macabre, which you often see depicted in old frescoes or woodcuts, showed personified death, usually as skeletons, leading people from all walks of life, kings, peasants, popes, children, inexorably to the grave. These artistic and devotional traditions were explicitly designed to urge Christians to remember the inevitability of death, the vanity of earthly life, and not to forget the end of all earthly things, prompting them towards piety and repentance. So this provides a powerful, distinctly non-pagan explanation for why a Christian feast day focused on the dead, All Saints and All Souls, might naturally become preoccupied with themes of fate, mortality, and even divination games related to life and death. It frames it as a Christian theological concern about salvation in the afterlife, rather than just a pagan concern about, say, the next harvest or finding a spouse.
Okay, I can see that as a compelling reason why the church might have allowed or perhaps even recontextualized the existing fascination with death and fate around that time. But I'd still argue that the specific mechanism of predicting fate using particular natural items like nuts and apples tied to the harvest season feels like a holdover from Samhain's core function as the calendar transition point. It's the moment the old year symbolically dies and the new year is born, which naturally makes it seem potent for divining the future. The church may have successfully overlaid a new meaning, like memento mori, but I'm not sure they entirely invented the practice itself. It seems more like adaptation.
It certainly seems we are deeply entrenched now in defining whether the mechanism, the practice itself, or the overarching meaning and framework holds the greater weight in defining the holiday's core origin. This actually feels like a perfect moment before we dive into some of the scholarly tension around this. To remind our listeners, if you're enjoying this discussion, please do hit that like button and subscribe to the show for more intellectual exchanges like this one.
Yes, an excellent suggestion. And to continue exploring that tension, we probably should address some of the historical scholarship itself, which attempts to untangle or sometimes maybe oversimplify the link between these two traditions, Samhain and Allhallowtide.
Absolutely. We have to acknowledge the critique of some of the influential early scholarship in this area. Many contemporary academics now caution that the idea of a direct, unbroken link between ancient Samhain and modern Halloween is often presented as more tenuous than the popular narrative suggests. We have to be wary of, romanticizing the past. Figures like Sir James Frazer, the highly influential anthropologist who wrote The Golden Bough, his work was foundational for many, but later scholars argue he might have conflated the rites of Samhain with those of the much more clearly documented Christian All Souls' Day practices. This could have perhaps unintentionally exaggerated the pagan legacy, creating the popular but potentially somewhat misleading idea that Samhain was primarily and singularly a festival dedicated to the dead, when its scope was likely broader.
I approach it from a slightly different angle. While we absolutely must be critical of early 20th century romanticism, and yes, Fraser's tendency sometimes to draw grand, possibly overly universal conclusions from limited evidence, the source material itself, folk tales, local records, observations from the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, still clearly demonstrates the remarkable persistence of specific Gaelic folk customs in Celtic regions. Things like the bonfires, the guising, the focus on this liminal spiritual time. These practices endured, even when they were demonstrably at odds with, say, Reformed Christian teachings that were dominant elsewhere in Britain.
But hang on, if the link was truly so strong and unbroken, why did the church feel the need to, as you say, co-opt the date and promote their own rituals so aggressively? Wouldn't the Samhain traditions just have continued under their own steam?
Well, arguably, they had to promote them aggressively precisely because the underlying folk traditions were so powerful and deeply ingrained. We have records, for instance, from places like Scotland and Ireland, where parish elders and church authorities actively tried and often failed to ban these ancient rites of passage, these Samhain-descended customs like bonfires and guising. The very difficulty they faced seems to confirm that the pagan or folk tradition possessed an enduring foundational strength. So the church, finding itself unable to simply eliminate these deeply rooted customs, perhaps chose the more pragmatic strategy, absorption and rebranding, establishing All Hallows Eve as the acceptable Christianized framework around Samhain traditions. The very fact that rebranding seemed necessary, to me, confirms that the Samhain traditions provided the resilient foundation, not just a few superficial customs that were easily dismissed or replaced.
So, wrapping up my perspective, the core argument remains rooted in, institutional permanence and structure. Halloween's survival, its shape, its very name, relies almost entirely, I argue, on the Christian liturgical calendar. The name Halloween, from All Hallows Eve, the established date of the vigil on October 31st, and the clear development of organized charitable house-to-house solicitation through the practice of souling, these seem firmly rooted in the Christian observance of Allhallowtide. From this view, it's fundamentally a Christian holiday that skillfully absorbed and repurposed some older folk rituals into its own framework.
And for me, looking at it differently, the holiday's most pervasive, popular customs and its deepest symbolism, the thin veil, the emphasis on powerful wandering spirits, the use of disguises, the fortune-telling games that lingered for so long, these feel like enduring echoes, powerful reverberations of the original Samhain traditions. The holiday's true meaning, its emotional core, seems demonstrably tied to that older pagan worldview, regardless of the Christian institutions that later chose to wrap a new calendar and perhaps a more palatable name around it.
Well, it's clear the evolution of Halloween is definitely not a simple linear path from A to B. It's a profound cultural layering, isn't it? A really complex collision over centuries of Celtic spirituality, maybe some Roman harvest practices, and certainly medieval Christian doctrine and folk piety. And it leaves us with a holiday today that continues to reflect our ancient and perhaps ongoing multi-layered attempts to navigate mortality, mystery, and the boundary between worlds.
It really is a remarkable case study, I think, in how deeply held folk beliefs and practices can persist, adapt, and resonate through millennia, even when facing the immense pressure of global institutional religions. There is clearly so much more to explore in these fascinating origins.
We certainly hope this discussion has given everyone listening a deeper appreciation for the complex and often debated history behind Halloween. And one last time, we encourage you to hit that like button if you found this interesting, and please subscribe to the show for more deep dives and intellectual exchanges.
Thank you for listening to The Debate.
Thank you for listening to Two Beans in a Pod. If you are interested in the book, please order it from the link below.